Welcome to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant Interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in who gets funded? Become a HAPS donor today by visiting www.hapsfund.com/donate.
Hey folks, thanks for joining us again as we interview our last round of applicants for the HAPS grant that are related to the Hebrew Bible. We're going to meet with a couple of folks this afternoon, but before we get started, I just wanted to say, hey, my name's El. You might have seen me around the channel before. I'm a co-host of Assyriology Today alongside Sarah Moore, who did the last set of interviews. Super excited to talk to these folks. They have interesting sounding research. I hope you will stay engaged and ask any questions that you might have for the applicants in the chat. That way, hopefully, they'll be able to answer some of them and get you a little more info on what they're doing. I guess without any further ado, let's meet our first applicant. Hi,
Hello.
welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. Can you start by introducing yourself for us and tell us where you're talking to us from?
Yes, I'm from Israel, from the city of Hebron, you know, the city of Abraham and Isaac, where they are, the tomb is there.
Wonderful. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm working as a guide of survival skills. Also, I'm a teacher in school, and I do 3 degrees in the area of ancient Near East in the subject of the Bible, and also I train people how to fight martial arts, and also in the army, and a rabbi also.
That's wonderful. How did you get involved in all of these fields, maybe also martial arts, but specifically the ancient Near East and the Bible?
This is a very interesting subject. You know, I have from my childhood, I have a collection of all things that I found in the area, archaeological stuff like coins, and I have also swords and things that you can find in the area, because all the area was in the ancient time, a lot of civilization lived here, and you can find a lot of things from the past. So all the subject is very curious, and because I train people to fight in martial arts and also anti-terror in the army, the subject of war in the ancient time was very appealing for me.
That's wonderful. It's such an interesting background and way to get involved with this. Can you tell us a little bit about your plans for this summer and how you would use the HAPS funding to help you out?
Yeah, I want to take my family to a vacation on a trailer. We go a lot for the woods and do camping, and for 1 week or 2 weeks in the nature. Especially, I love to do all the skills. This is the main thing that we are going to do.
What do you hope to find on such a trip? Are you hoping that you'll run across some additional ruins or some things that you might be able to work into your studies?
Usually I find ruins. Usually I find things. I have quite a good vision, and people ask me how you can find all those coins or old stuff. Yeah, but in Israel we have the rule is said that you need to report it to of course, for the government, but I have a license to keep few of the things, and other things you need to give them for the government.
Sure. Yeah. How did you get involved with working? You said as a guide, you do guided tours. How did you get involved with that?
Not tours. I'm guide students. How I think when I finished my army, I thought I want to educate people, so I go to the field of education and start work as a teacher and a guide. This is nice to help people to know things and to.
Yeah, absolutely. Teachers are incredibly important. What subjects do you teach?
Mostly I teach about old skills, primitive skills, navigation skills, historical of the land, the history of the land, and things like that. Everything that belong to the nature, but in a survival, I think, point of view.
That's fascinating. So we'd love to open up the questions to anyone who's watching right now and has any questions for our applicant. In the meantime, I'm hoping maybe you might be willing to share a story with us of something that interesting that's happened to you on one of these trips. Anything come to your mind immediately?
I will tell something from the last time that I go to for old place. So I found that there are a lot of people that want to dig and find things, but they are robbers. And in the last time I found a tomb that robbers start to dig in there, and I found the shoes of a little girl from, it's not so old, but something like 150 years ago. This is not interesting in Israel. If something is not 300 years old, it's not archaeology. But but I find a lot of things in the field.
Great, thanks for sharing. We have a couple of questions in the audience right now. If you're ready, Mark is interested to know: are you studying anything in particular, or do you have a dissertation topic for your academic work?
Yes, I'm working about how the Bible, the literature Bible, describe the warrior. If there is volumes for the Jewish or the Israeli warrior in the Bible, especially in the historiographic literature. And in my MA, I start to work on that, and I continue that subject. And there is a lot of interesting finding in this area.
That's fascinating. We have another question from the audience. Do you feel that your personal military experience informs your understanding of military figures in the Hebrew Bible?
I'm sure of it, because when you are engaged in fight, or you really have experience, sometimes in the Bible there are rules, and if you don't have the experience and know all the difficulties of the warrior, or how a warrior thinks, so sometimes you can say this is very odd what the Bible said. But I think the experience is very important for somebody that want to understand why the Bible decided to wrote that thing or another thing, or there are a few rules that very specific for the Bible. So I think, yeah.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for talking with us today. Is there anything you'd like to add before we close out?
No, I think my topic is very interesting, and I will be happy to speak about it.
Well, thanks for speaking with us about it. Folks, we're going to take a quick break here. Stay tuned. We'll be back in at 4 o'clock with our next applicant. Hey folks, thanks for joining us again. We're ready to meet some of our other applicants for the HAPS grant this summer. Up next, we have Ludwig. Hi.
Hi, EL. Nice
How are
to
you
meet
doing today?
Thank you for. I'm doing well, thank you.
Yeah, it's great to meet you. Can you start by introducing yourself to us and letting us know where you're talking to us from?
Yeah, sure. My name is Ludwig Noya. I'm originally from Indonesia, but I'm currently in Nashville studying for my PhD in Vanderbilt University.
Wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the field that you're studying?
Sure. Yeah. I was raised in a certain Christian denomination who relatively upholds the Old Testament more than other Christian denomination. So that's why I'm interested in Hebrew Bible, and especially most of the time back in global South in Indonesia, when people comes from the Europe and America, people will gather together and to watch that. And I was asking, okay, why this always white people come down here? So why don't I come up there and probably I can contribute something.
That's wonderful. What did you study in your undergrad?
I did theology, my theology degree. Yeah.
So that lends itself very, very nicely to where you are. Talk to us a little bit about what your research interests are.
Sure. Yeah. But before I describe my project, I think I need to throw a word of caution.
Okay.
If during these following several minutes, audience and you hear words that are not in your vocabulary, please rest assured that it is not because you have not updated your dictionary, but it is most likely because of my bad pronunciation. So please forgive me for butchering the first language of most, if not all of you. Okay, so as I told you before, I was raised in a certain Christian denomination who holds Old Testament pretty highly, especially the 7-day Sabbath. I am deeply interested to research about Sabbath. While it seems to be delightful for me that once a week one can stop working and that all people should stop working on that day, our current context, that is the pandemic, invited me to reconsider this notion. How so? In the pandemic context, we have the notion of stay at home and work from home. But notice that not all of us can afford to stay at home or to work from home. Some of us may not have a home at all. Some of us may work in a field that cannot be done from home, or some of us is the essential workers whom the society needs in daily basis. Or some of us need to go out to work every day, otherwise there won't be any food on the table. While there are 1% who don't have to work per se, but the money is still rolling down rapidly to their bank account easily. So for me, the notion of stay at home and work from home is a privilege. This situation invited me to think whether the concept of Sabbath rest is also a privilege, whether the Sabbath rest truly benefits all people or only certain people, whether the Sabbath rest is a site of struggle for different class of people, for different groups of people. And in pursuing this question, there are three elements come into play. First, the Hebrew Bible text, especially the narrative portion, like Exodus 16, Numbers 15, Nehemiah 13. Because while in the legal or prophetic portions, we see an idyllic version of Sabbath rest that all people can and should get the rest so they can be refreshed and so on. Narrative portion portray a more complicated picture. Now, I have to mention that this project utilizes the ideological approaches like class analysis and post-colonial studies in order to bring to the surface the ideological conflict, the class struggle, the resistance to domination embedded in the text. For instance, one of the texts that I will analyze is Exodus 16, as I mentioned, where we have people who go out on the Sabbath to gather manna, the bread from heaven, and we easily blame them for transgression. But the pandemic context I mentioned earlier invited us to think, how about those who need to go out, otherwise there won't be any food on the table? Especially when the information about the absence of manna in the Sabbath is limited to a certain people, to the leaders, not to all the people. Now, the second element is the ancient Near Eastern context. While earlier scholarship tends to give attention to the 7-day cycle itself, I will give more attention to the concept of rest itself, the so-called work-free day. And we seems to have the 10-day work cycle in Deir el-Medina, Egypt, where the 9 and 10 days are free. Though the cycle number is different, the concept of rest seems to be comparable. But what is interesting in this community is that it was a community of tomb workers, craftsmen. So I want to inquire how this community, given the fact that they are craftsmen, gets their food supply, and whether those who supply the food for them also share the notion of work-free day cycle, or they work all the time. And also whether the craftsmen, so-called free days, belong to them, or whether they have to administer the judicial system or cultic practices for the benefits of the higher ruling class. Now, this so-called ancient context will be put in conversation with the third element, the later modern colonial era in the global south, like in colonial South Africa, colonial Australia, and Southeast Asia, especially when the biblical Sabbath work-rest cycle is utilized by the British colonial to replace the indigenous time, which they see as an irregular time to enhance the productivity. So my project aims to show how the notion of rest throughout the ages have been a privilege and also a site of struggle, as it has both a liberative aspect, but also exploitative and dominative potential. And I think it is important to hold this tension.
This sounds like such a fascinating research project. Were you already thinking about researching this area before the pandemic and lockdowns hit? Is that metaphor just accidentally very good, or did it actually help sort of steer you down this path?
I would say it. As I mentioned earlier, I was raised in the denomination which upholds the Sabbath. So I know I need to research about the Sabbath. And when the pandemic hits, it's like giving me some sort of aha moment about what is the situation and what I'm struggling with, which also might be also a struggle back then in the ancient context of Sabbath situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit then about what your specific plans for this summer are and how you might use the HAPS funding to help you achieve them.
Sure. Thank you. Well, my plan is basically to delve in with the project directly without worrying on finding a job on the summer, which since the pandemic hits have been extremely reduced. During the summer, I usually work full-time, both to sustain my family's summer needs as well as to help our daily needs in the regular semester. So the grant will be very helpful for us to cover the fast-growing development of living costs in Nashville, especially when my spouse is unable to work due to the immigration policy.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to open up to audience questions here shortly. So if you've got any questions for Ludwig, please feel free to type them right now. And we have a first one right here. Are the Egyptian rest days understood in religious terms like the Sabbath is?
It's interesting because the second part of the question assumed that the Sabbath is primarily a religious idea, and whether we can really differentiate between the religious or socio-economic concern of the ancient folks. So I think it is interesting to see how in the level of the socio-economic level, this notion of rest works, and how it bring up to the so-called higher ideological level, both in the political or religious.
You mentioned in discussing, especially I think the third prong of your research, the modern and comparisons to indigenous timekeeping. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little more to our audience and to me personally about indigenous timekeeping and how this differs from maybe some of the more familiar conceptions of the week.
Okay, sure. Well, let me bring my own context, which is Indonesia. We've been told that our land is really fruitful and productive land. When if you eat some oranges, for instance, and you throw the seed on the backyard, it will grow. The tree. So it's really productive, and it's really easy to earn, to get your food. But so when you get your sufficient food for a certain days, you will stop working. But when the modern colonial comes with the capitalistic mindset and say, like, you know what, you're spending your time, you're wasting your time. What you have to do is consistently doing the work. And in this case, they bring out the biblical Sabbath, in which you have to work 6 days, not only 2 days, even though you already fulfill your basic needs in 2 days. But you have to work 6 days. And the reason is basically to enhance the productivity. So, you can sell the rest of the stuff that you did not consume.
This is incredibly fascinating. And I think a lot of your research ties really deeply into certain conceptions in the modern world of class and power. And so I'm very interested to see how your research takes shape. Do we have any other questions from people watching this thread? I'm happy to keep asking Ludwig questions, but I don't want to dominate the chat here. Well, while I give you time to type those out, maybe I'll just ask a couple more. And I'm curious, you mentioned with regards to I think a couple specific groups in the third prong, the modern context. But I'm curious what cultural groups you're looking at for some of your earlier work. Are you limiting your research to ancient Near Eastern sources? I think you mentioned Egyptian sources as well, right? So maybe talk a little bit about what sources and what cultures you're looking at for this research, if you can.
Do you mean the second one, the ancient Near Eastern context?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. Well, so far until this point, the research on Sabbath rest specifically always focus on the seven-day form. So where can we find the 7-day form? So we may find it in the Mesopotamian. We might find it in the Ugaritics, and some of them cannot make it together how the 7-day notions and the concept of Sabbath rest you are presenting the sacrifice on the Bible fits together, and they think it's primarily on the Hebrew Bible. But I think, how about we talk about rest itself, whether it is really a liberative aspect or whether they have a exploitative potential, even in the book where it assumes it is a liberative.
That's great. We have a question from chat about the nature of rest. Mark says, I wonder if the rest day for people like field workers and makers or craftsmen would be used for other needs that aren't food, household, legal, or even time tithing, i.e. work for the temple.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, up to this point, it's hardly to find that field workers, in terms of the cultivating land, to have a rest. At least in Deir el Medina, what we have, the rest is preserved only to the craftsmen, which is the privileged workers. But their so-called free days is not totally for themselves, because they have to administer these different systems which actually belong to the higher ruling class, but they are utilized in doing so in order you have a free works. So let me say this, in my specific tradition is we are really give portion for the lay people to administer the church event. But notice if, for instance, the work of that layman is a business person, stock holders or whatever, their church work may be different from their daily works. But how about biblical scholars whose daily works is also studying the Bible, and they have to work also on that 7th day by teaching the Bible or studying the Bible. So I think it's interesting to see to which this rest belong to at all.
Absolutely. On that note, do you see any differences in the available sources between genders? Do you find most of your sources speak toward the free time of men in society as opposed to women?
Exactly. That is interesting because when this will tie into the notion of the free itself, right? And it will be tied into the notion of capitalistic. So which work basically is a work and which work is a free, and whether one can really have a totally freedom for themselves. And most of the time, genders also comes into play. While, for instance, in the modern era, we can see how if people go to church, the woman, the mom will have really heavy work for preparing the kids, and that's also play in the gender dynamics in that notion.
Absolutely. Before we close out, if you're comfortable sharing at all, Ludwig, we have some questions in the chat. If you're willing to share what specific tradition it is that you come from, that you're drawing on for this research.
Yeah, I came from a 7-day Adventist tradition.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing about that. And then again, before we finish up here, is there anything that you're interested in sharing that we haven't asked about? Any aspect of your research or anything?
I think so far I already told the bird view of my research, but I think, okay, let me give me one thing. Most of the time when people do research on the Sabbath, they think how easy is that Sabbath is, how delightful is that, because they are not in the bottom level. But in the bottom level, there are people who cannot do even work, even though within the church that are really uphold their tradition. For instance, you have a security who have to hold the perimeter securely, especially in Indonesia, where Christian is a minority. You have to have to guard the church while people are worshiping. There are people work for the church, and those who prepare for the food after the church cannot have that privilege of free rest. So I think I'm trying to bring this perspective from the those in the lower class of people or lower level of people in this research.
I think that's wonderful, and I think that's incredibly important. It's been an absolute delight talking with you today, Ludwig. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Great. We'll take a little break now as we prep for our next applicant, so hang on tight. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. Hey folks, welcome back. We're ready to speak with our next applicant. Hi, Carrie. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. So start with maybe introducing yourself and letting us know where you're talking to us from today.
Okay, I'm Carrie Cyphers. I am currently in Charlottesville, Virginia, pursuing a Ph.D. at University of Virginia in Hebrew Bible.
Wonderful. How did you end up in that field? How did you get started in studying the Hebrew Bible?
That's a good question. I think, so I was a linguistics major in undergrad, loved languages, loved the idea of a history of a language, that languages evolve over time and that you can sort of track their history. And I took a Hebrew class and fell in love with it. At the same time, I started taking some religious studies classes, entered a Hebrew Bible class, and fell in love with it. Thought I was done with school forever, but then, 5 years later, I went back to school to with the desire to study more of the Hebrew Bible and also to facilitate the classroom discussion of the Hebrew Bible. Is such a generative compendium of thought-provoking texts. So that's a short version.
Oh, that's wonderful. You have a lot of linguistics fans in the chat, and I will say also in me too. I studied that as part of my graduate studies, so it's great to find another use for linguistics. So tell us then a little bit about your research interests now.
Okay. So I, as I began sort of the deeper academic study of the Hebrew Bible, I came to see that the study of it has been sort of dominated by this idea that the Hebrew Bible is sort of like an archaeological tell. There's layers of strata from ancient Israel and Judah, these ancient Near Eastern kingdoms. And, if we can peel back the layers, we can see different political and social situations from, antiquity. And I think that's an incredibly valuable enterprise that many people are, still doing with the Hebrew Bible. But I am interested in sort of the 2,500 to 2,000 years of interpretation that this text, once it sort of became compiled, has been adapted and read by the most unlikeliest of communities throughout history, in the sense that they're not ancient Israel and Judah, right? They're just many, many other communities that have taken these stories and allowed them to shape their self-identity as individuals and as communities, but also shape their ethics and their understanding of or their perception of other people as well. So I'm very interested in the ethics of that enterprise because it can be very good. We've seen in human history liberation movements and human rights movements that have found themselves rooted or understood themselves to be rooted in the biblical story of the Exodus. But then on the other hand, there have been, subjugation of women and silencing of women throughout the generations, finding themselves rooted in Genesis 3, or, the forced removals of the Friends of America, finding themselves rooted in the narratives of Joshua. So there's this sort of bipolar, scattering throughout history of this process of people reading these narratives and being shaped by these narratives and then acting on that shaping. So my work sort of studies that, what makes a story dangerous? What makes a story good? And how does retelling these narratives do one or the other? Yeah.
That's fascinating. That's wonderful. So then what are your specific plans for this summer related to your research, and how can HAPS help you achieve it?
Right. I would really like to say something really fancy, like I'm going to go fly somewhere and look at a dusty old manuscript, or I just really want to dig in the dirt somewhere and find wonderful artifacts that will enrich our understanding of humanity. But basically, my program provides for us during the school year, and then funding kind of runs out over the summer. And I'm a mom, so I really need rent and childcare to continue my work. So that's how this I see the HAPS funding financially is helping me. But as far as professionally, I'm really intrigued. My advisor sent me the HAPS information, and I hadn't even heard of HAPS until then. And so I think professionally, I'm excited about the idea of sharing my research and starting conversations with, other people other human beings who live and breathe and live in this world that maybe it could be very generative to have those conversations with.
That's wonderful to hear. Yeah. The lowered summer stipend, if it exists for grad students, is a story that we are familiar with here at HAPS.
Yeah.
So I know we have a couple of questions in the chat already, but let's maybe start with a sort of basic question about what we even mean when we're talking about the Hebrew Bible. So when you, in particular, talk about the Hebrew Bible, which version do you mean?
That is a good question. I see that, the modern Masoretic version. So it's a good question, because there, even in this, richly layered text, there is a long history, over 1,000 years, almost 1,500-year history of these texts being passed along and copied and transmitted. And there are ways to study the older, trying to find the most original version, and that's usually through the use of the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation made in, 200s BCE, possibly 300s BCE, but probably 200s BCE. So that's always in the purview of my research. Do I need to pay attention to the Hebrew pointing, which came much later, and therefore could possibly change the interpretation of the text? Yes, I pay attention to it. But my central study is in two later texts, so two later historical texts. They self-present as history, that retell the Genesis narrative in ways that provide a very straightforward ethical evaluation of the Genesis narrative in two different ways. So I'm not so much doing the deep textual work of, finding the original text of the Hebrew Bible, but I'm looking at those later stories and how they received the Hebrew Bible and then retold it for their generation.
Excellent. We have other questions from the audience. Mark asks, are you looking both at the ways in which readers are shaped by what they read and the way people take the text and shape it to their own ends or their own philosophies?
Right. And I think you've hit on something that's very, it's like a teetering on a fence. Which direction do these things go? I'm of course interested in the former, that the idea that a story has the power to shape a person in a community when those people receive it to be instructive or authoritative. So that process I'm very interested in, because the stories that become authoritative to a community thus have a greater shaping power on their identity and on their ethics. But also, it's how can I discern between that process, especially when we're talking about antiquity, where I can't walk around with a microphone and ask people, what's happening, but also the other process of having an agenda, having an identity, having an ethic, and then appropriating these texts to legitimize, to validate. So it's definitely a tension that I'm aware of and grappling with. Yeah.
That's great. Maybe I'll interject one of my own questions here, and that is just, how are you, or are you in general, drawing on some of your linguistics education prior to this as you're studying the sort of morals and ethics of this?
Right. So along the way, I realized that I actually need to know ancient Ethiopic. So it really helps to have that sort of, linguistic background, just for acquiring language that I need to know and work with. Some of the texts that I'm studying where we have fragments in Hebrew, which was the language that they were composed in, but then the only full copies that we have are in Ethiopic. So that's one way, but also in my sort of close textual scrutiny as well. It's just part of the job. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. We have more questions now from the audience. What non-biblical texts are you working with?
So I'm working with the text of Jubilees, which was, it self-presents as a historical retelling of Genesis through mid-Exodus. So it's actually the narrator is an angel, telling Moses all those things that happened. But in the time period when it was written, that was understood to be the historical reality of how this text came to be, of how these stories came to be, was that they were revealed to Moses. And then the other one is Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, which knew of Jubilees, and I'm arguing intentionally reshaped some narratives in response to Jubilee shaping.
That's great. Maybe just as an interested outsider here, can I ask, how has this research that you've been doing in these texts shaped some of the ways that you approach the ways that the Bible gets interpreted and changed in modern pop culture? Is that something that lends itself, I think, to your research?
Definitely. It's fascinating to me. I think it's helped me to turn and look at the Hebrew Bible with a critical eye to ask, what is it about these texts that lend themselves to so many different interpretations? So a big bulk of my work is, so I'm using a case study from Genesis. So Genesis 34 in particular, which, I mean, we could talk about, we just don't have the time. It's just so intense. So I'm looking at that narrative in particular and analyzing it through the lens of narrative ethics, which asks, what about the form of this text lends itself to certain ethical engagements from its audience? And so there's this multi-perspectivity that the Hebrew Bible is just so well known for, and the ambiguity of characterization. There's so many silences and gaps which have lent themselves to a multiformity of interpretations and retellings. In that sense, it's those characteristics which have made it so ready to be taken up by different contexts and different generations over time, different people groups.
That's wonderful. You mentioned early on that one of the things that you found interesting was the unlikely communities you found adopting some of these stories and narratives. I'm wondering if you could share maybe what was the most surprising community to you, or what might be the most unexpected one for us as your audience.
Ooh, that's a...
I mean, I think Ethiopic speakers is also maybe something we wouldn't have expected in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, and I mean, that's, so ancient Ge'ez, Ethiopic. I'm blanking in my narrative nervousness to come up with a really fun and interesting, but I'm sure 5 minutes after this interview, I'll have one for you.
That's how it always works, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's been really lovely talking with you about this research. It sounds really fascinating. I know the audience has been really excited to read this research when it comes out, or maybe hear about it online. From Mark. I want to read this when she's done.
All right.
Before we close out, though, I'd really love to hear, is there anything else you want us to know about your research or about your plans? Anything that I didn't ask you that I should have?
I don't think so. Yeah. This has been fun. Thank you so much for having me and having this conversation.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for talking with us, and thanks for sharing. We'll take another quick break here while we get set up with our next applicant. So stay tuned, and we'll see you in a bit. Hey everyone, welcome back. We're getting ready to talk with our next HAPS applicant, Eric. Hey
Hello.
Eric, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Can you start by introducing yourself and letting us know where you're talking to us from?
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Eric. I am in Decatur, Georgia, and I'm in the Hebrew Bible track in the Graduate Division of Religion at Emory University.
That's great. Well, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up in your field? What got you interested in it?
Sure. Yeah. So if there's one word to really sum it up, it's lucrative. When I heard of all the wealth that academics and biblical scholars make, there was just really no decision to be made.
Oh yeah.
But if they're a close number two would have to be just that I love these stories. I love these texts. I love these traditions. I think they're fascinating and interesting. I think the study of ancient cultures and religions, it's like a treasure hunt for the products of human brilliance. It's this great inheritance that all of us, that humanity has received from those who've gone before us. I think, you and I and everyone watching, we're not the first people to reflect on love or war or wisdom or God or justice. And the study of these texts, they provide us with these products of human brilliance and give us the opportunity to continue to grow and learn and reflect and receive those gifts from those who've come before us.
Two very good answers, I think. So with money on your mind then, what are your particular research interests related to the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, so very broadly, I'm interested in the ways that religious and mythological texts function in the formation of identities and political ideologies. So a lot of my work utilizes the sort of classical, traditional, historical, critical toolkit. So philology, mastery of ancient languages, study of material culture, and iconography, synthesized with the insights of more recent literary criticism and literary theory. So Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics, for example, or Derrida's insights in post-structuralism. A major guiding question for a lot of my work is, how does the reading of this certain text or the reception of this idea change when it's encountered in different contexts? So in virtue of the discipline that I find myself in, the corpus that I interact with quite a lot is the religious and mythological traditions of the ancient Near East, of which the Hebrew Bible is a major inheritance, but not the only one.
This is a fascinating research interest that I'm sure we'll have questions about later. I know I do. But before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about what your specific plans are for the summer and how HAPS funding can help you achieve them?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I've been doing recently has focused on Ugarit. And the major research project that I'm hoping to complete this summer, which I would be using the HAPS grant towards, is a new reading of an Ugaritic mythological text. So generally, a lot of people know about ancient Israel, ancient Judah, Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, but Ugarit, people don't know about Ugarit for some reason, which I think is sort of a shame. So if I may, very briefly, just a quick background on Ugarit. Ugarit was a late Bronze Age city kingdom located on the coast of northern Syria, and modern scholarship has only fairly recently become aware of the texts and traditions of Ugarit. To slightly oversimplify the story, in 1928, a farmer was plowing his field, put a shovel in the ground, but didn't hit dirt, hit a rock. And it was a door to a tomb. And a year later, excavators showed up and excavated Tel Ras Shamra and discovered the site of the ancient city kingdom of Ugarit. And we discovered all of these cuneiform tablets that had a language that up to that point we hadn't encountered before, which is, that alone is already, hasn't been a movie made about this yet, but maybe Indiana Jones 5 will touch on it or something.
Maybe.
Maybe, we can hope. So the language was deciphered in 1930, And we continue to learn more about the political history of Ugarit. Ugarit was able, through its lifetime, to maintain a modicum of wealth and power, largely because of where it fell on the map at the intersection of a number of important trade routes, but also because of falling at the intersection of all of these trade routes, Ugarit found herself constantly torn between loyalty to the most powerful nations that existed at the time, largely the Egyptians and the Hittites. So to give you an example of what was going on in Ugarit, at one point in the mid-14th century, Ugarit was paying tribute for military protection, which sort of like when the mob comes to your restaurant and says, hey, pay up and we'll protect you, or don't pay up and we'll see what happens when you don't have protection. Ugarit was paying for military protection to the southern kingdom of Amuru and to the Hittites, and at the same time, Egypt was mustering troops to begin an anti-Hittite insurrection in other Syrian states. All this to say, Ugarit was constantly walking a thin line between keeping all the opposing and more powerful nations at bay and satisfied, typically at a high cost to their own piggy bank. So, in the midst of all this, one of the royal scribes, and we have his name because he signed, which is fascinating because most scribes didn't sign their names. A royal scribe, Ilimilku, writes down the Kirta epic, a story about a powerful king who earns the favor of the high god Ale and is granted a son. Now, in the less than 100 years with which scholars have been trying to make sense of this story, most interpretations have carried these assumptions about how religion must have worked in Ugarit. Surely the scribes would never compose anything that was critical of a king, or God forbid, critical of the gods. So we must read the story sympathetically with King Kirta and with Ale. But, I say, if we drop this anachronistic religious baggage, that's not the only way to read this story. The characterizations of King Kirta and the high god Ale are surprising at times. Ale is often aloof, and Kirta is off running errands and making vows to people and goddesses that he then promptly forgets. And the end of the story has Kirta's son, Yatsibu, attempting to usurp the throne from his father. Again, most interpreters have read the story sympathetically with Kirta. One scholar even calls Kirta's son a spoiled brat. I don't think that's what's going on here at all. I think that this Ugaritic scribe, living under the experience of the whims of the superpowers of his day, told this story in such a way to provide a language that reflects on issues of sovereignty, godhood, and kingship in surprisingly critical ways. The story he tells is complex and nuanced and sophisticated, and frankly, people should be hearing it. But most of us don't know it. Most of us don't even know what Ugaritic is. When I told my grandma that I was studying Ugaritic a few years ago, she said, "Bugaritic? That sounds spooky." So here's my project. The final tablet of the Kirta epic gives the speech that Yatsibu makes in his attempt to usurp his father's throne. In the decades of interpretation, translators have struggled to make sense of the first few lines of his speech. They're filled with what's called hapax legomena, words that don't occur anywhere else, and so it's really hard to translate them and figure out what they mean because we don't have other contexts. And there's still no consensus on how to make sense of exactly what he's saying. With the tools of classical comparative philology, I want to offer a new reading of his speech. And this new reading suggests that the theme of Yatsibu's speech is the contrast between the appearance of power and the enacting of justice. By the way, does this theme still feel relevant in 2021, year of our Lord? I say maybe. So once you've established the meaning of Yatsibu's speech, of these lines in Yatsibu's speech, it becomes a lens through which you can reread the entire narrative and see the ways that the scribe is reflecting on kingship, on sovereignty, on power, in a really critical light that up to this point, scholars just we haven't been talking about it. So the first half of this project is really utilizing that classic historical critical toolkit. And then the second half is trying to take up some of the insights of more recent philosophical hermeneutics and post-structuralism and literary theory to provide this new reading of the Kirta epic. So that's my project. That's my goal.
Sounds like a fascinating project. Sounds also like you've got a pitch ready to go for Indiana Jones 6. So we'll look forward to that.
Disney, if you want to call me anytime, I'm ready to go.
We have a couple of questions, some from me, but if anyone in the audience has any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat now. We can make sure to pose them to Eric. I'll just first start with, I've seen some people remark on the name of the god Ale, and I'm hoping you can talk maybe a little bit about who this character is so that we don't all just think he's the patron saint of beer.
Yeah, so ale, raise your glass of ale for ale. Ale is in the West Semitic Canaanite pantheon. He's sort of like the high god. Maybe, well, you probably don't want to think of Zeus because Zeus is a bit more active, right? But think of older guy with a long gray beard. That's how he's described. In a lot of the ritual texts from Ugarit, we have prayers to Ale. Ale seems to have been venerated in the religion at Ugarit as the ruler of the divine council. So Ale is sort of in the highest seat, and then you have Baal and Anat and all of Ale's 70 or 700 children, the whole pantheon. But in the narrative texts from Ugarit, Ale is characterized in a strange way. Ale is really old, and he kind of gets bossed around by his younger children, which is a strange story to tell about the high god in your religion. At one point, Ale's daughter, Anat, she really wants to, this is in the Akkad epic, she really wants to murder this human who has dissed her. And she goes to Ale for permission. Ale says, no, you don't have to kill him. And Anat says, old man, I'll make your gray beard run with gore from your head. And Ale says, oh, okay. Yeah, no one can tell you. No one can say no. Go ahead. You can have his life. So it's a very strange way of characterizing the most powerful deity in the dominant religion of the culture, which I think speaks to some of the most, just what is going on in these stories. There's something very critical, something very reflective, something very ethically, religiously, politically nuanced in these stories that the scribe is telling.
Absolutely. What a fascinating character. I think we've got a question from Mark in chat. Who do you think might have been the author's audience, if not buttering up a king?
Good question. So I think that to a certain degree, this story may have been buttering up the king, just not the most powerful king. I think this story may have been, in a sense, buttering up the Ugaritic king, but not so much, say, in the Egyptian pharaohs or the rulers of the Hittites. I think that what's going on here, because certainly, scribalism, the ability to read and write and compose these long narratives, it's an elite thing. It's an elite activity. This scribe, Ili Milku, we have good reason to believe that he was in the inner circle of the royal court and probably had correspondence with the king. It's possible that this text was written for the king or for the king's court. But remember that Ugarit lived its existence largely under the boot of more powerful nations surrounding it. And so in telling this story in which the most powerful king kind of turns out to be a doofus and the most powerful god sort of turns out to be aloof, and then there's this youngster who actually believes in justice and righteousness and wants to step up and defend the rights of the poor and the widow and the orphan, that perhaps there's kind of an analog occurring between the young son of Kirta, who at the end of the narrative tries to usurp the throne to enact justice, and the Ugaritic king himself, who was living under the boot of these more powerful nations, but perhaps was critical of the political moves that Egypt or the Hittites or any of the surrounding Syrian nations were making.
We've had a couple of requests. Are you on Twitter or Instagram so that people can follow you and hopefully learn a little more about this story?
I am on Twitter. What is my Twitter handle? I think it's Eric McDonald 7 because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 were taken.
Sure. Yeah. And then we have another question. What do you think about the theorized link between Anat, Athena, and Ta'anit?
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a big question. Let's see if I can knock this out of the park in just a few seconds here. So
no pressure.
Certainly cross-cultural contact was happening in the ancient Near East, right? And certainly no religious or mythological tradition is created out of a vacuum, is created ex nihilo. Everything's created out of the tohu vavohu, the wild and waste, the chaos and plunder of everything that's already around. So, in biblical studies, especially early last century, there's one famous text, the Old Testament Against Its Environment. People tried to argue that, oh, this tradition just sort of comes out of nowhere and it's totally unique. But we know that's just not true. And so certainly, are there traits of Anat and Athena? Has the high Canaanite god El been received by other communities and sort of morphed and taken on different characteristics in different communities with different concerns? Absolutely. That's often very, very difficult to trace. And I am skeptical of people who want to draw nice little maps with bullet points, that sort of arborescent model where you have this leads to this, leads to this. As Deleuze and Guattari, two wonderful French thinkers, would say, that things don't really happen arborescently, linearly. Things are more rhizomatic, sort of twisted, and this influences that, so it can be hard to map out, but certainly the influences are there. Absolutely.
That's a wonderful answer, and I like the term rhizomatic very much.
It's a good one.
So we're running near the end here. I'd like to just ask if there's anything that you want to share that I haven't asked you yet, maybe a final fact about Ugarit that you can't leave without having us know.
Yeah, let me just end by saying I really like this program. I like what the HAPS Fund is all about. I like what Digital Hammurabi is about. I want to reiterate that I think these Ugaritic stories, there's more. There's not just the Kirta epic. There's the Baal epic. There's the Akkad epic. They deserve to be known. These are some of the products of human brilliance. They're humanity's great inheritance that so far a handful of biblical scholars and a handful of scholars of the ancient Near East know about, but a lot of people don't know about them. And I think there are some good resources for reflecting on issues that we're facing today in these texts. So I'm just happy to be on this short little YouTube channel and share the good news about Ugarit with all the folks out there.
Well, thank you for sharing it with us. Indeed, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, Eric. All right, folks, we're going to take just a couple minutes to set up our next and our final applicant for the evening. So we'll see you in just a few minutes here. Hey everyone, welcome back. We're ready to talk with our final applicant for this afternoon. Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here, Yael.
It's our pleasure. Can you start maybe by just introducing yourself and letting us know where you're talking to us from?
Okay, my name is Yehuda Mansell, and I am located in Western Canada on the West Coast in Surrey, or pretty close to Vancouver, if you know where that is. And I'm studying out of Durham University and Vancouver School of Theology. So that's where I'm doing my my dissertation work.
Wonderful. How did you end up in your field? Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started there?
Well, I did a degree at Ben Gurion University in Bible, archaeology, and ancient Near Eastern studies, and with a minor in linguistics and literature. So I was kind of doomed after that. And I'd grown up with a deep interest in the Hebrew scriptures, and but it wasn't until I really got into the degree that my world got blown wide open. So that's how I got into this, and it's messed me up ever since. So.
Well, I think there's a deep love for the field of linguistics in the chat in here, so it's great to hear that that's in your background. So what are some of your research interests now?
So what for my dissertation work, what I've been working on is the Book of Job from the Hebrew scriptures and its relationship to ancient Near Eastern literature, and particularly the legal framework of the book. And there's a big question of whether understanding the book as a legal narrative is helpful in determining what's going on with some of the compositional funkiness of the book and maybe some of the theological funkiness of the book. It has been felt by some scholars to be kind of sliced and diced, and with various redactions and various, cut and paste things going on. Or, on the other hand, maybe understanding it through a legal, a trial motif would help us see where those seams are and how they actually work in the function of the narrative, in the function of the text. Like they're intentional, or they have some measure of use. So that's kind of what I'm invested in there. So that brings me deeply into linguistics and Hebrew, obviously, and Akkadian and Ugaritic. And I'm a deep, passionate lover of literature. So I just fall in love with the way stories move, the way poetry moves, and how readers can move along with it. So I'm deeply invested too in the matter of human suffering. And the Book of Job is usually intensely personal for anyone who decides to get involved with it. And there's a sense of, if you start to study the Book of Job, basically all hell is going to break loose in your life, is sort of the myth that surrounds it. But and so this comes out of a place of personal loss or personal trauma, and that's not abstract for me. So before my scholarship, I worked a lot with at-risk youth. I worked a lot with homeless and addicted folk, and working with Holocaust survivors. And presently am living and working with refugees. So the idea of loss and the idea of human suffering and how we try to give answers to that. We go all the way back into ancient Sumer, and we find that people are giving expression way back then to saying, what's going on? Why is this happening to me? Did I do something wrong? Did I piss off the gods? Like, what's going on here? And that narrative continues, throughout ancient Eastern literature, but it also goes on into the Hebrew Bible. And I feel Job allows us to sit well with suffering in ways that religion sometimes doesn't. It feels like the book almost is a rebel book in the Hebrew scriptures. Kind of stands out, and it allows us to angrily voice what's going on in our lives and the loss that we feel, but it also allows us to yell at God and say, where the heck are you? Like, come on out and fight me, as it were. And I love that. I love that honesty. I love that openness. And so I don't intend on answering the problem of human suffering, but I want to sit better with it. I think grad school removes any sense of that. You do that, you can't fix anything in this world. But I want to be able to sit better with suffering, and I want to be able to be carried along by the narrative and to think well. And as I sit with my neighbors, it's not abstract. It's hearing their stories and hearing what they've gone through. We can't explain it, but can we sit well with it? So that's where I'm coming from as far as my research. So
that's such an intensely personal story behind where you've ended up and what you've ended up studying. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thanks.
In a less sort of abstract way, maybe, what are your plans for this summer, and how can the HAPS funding help you achieve them, and how do they relate to this research that you've been talking about?
Well, for me this summer, I've done a lot of work already on the legal material that we have in the ancient Near East, and there's no lack of it. There's tons of these terse trial transcripts and disputations, and so stole someone's cow, and so we got a lot of that going on. But what I'm looking for this summer, and I'm digging into is there trial material that is in the form of literature? So like a good analog is like a John Grisham novel. We have these trial books, and none of us are lawyers except for Jay Caballero, but we all understand how a trial works. So a trial becomes a very interesting mechanism for understanding a story. So that's what I'll be looking for this summer, and poking into. A wonderful scholar who I became acquainted with recently, Yana Matuzik, maybe pronounced that wrong, introduced me to some Sumerian dispute texts and some hilarious, there's a text called "Are You a Woman?" and it's this sort of ranting and raving between two women, and it's just delightful. It's a Sumerian text. It's so funny. And there's some other literature that I've very recently, even within the last few weeks, have stumbled upon that I intend to build a good argument for trial as literature, not just trial as a technical function. So that's what I'm going to be working on this summer. Like many of us, I'm hunkered down at home. I have an 8-year-old daughter with me, and we're trying to homeschool right now because COVID's pretty bad in our area. And as most of us encounter, we don't have income, and scholarships are thin these days. So those are the things that I'm aware of right now. So summer is also going to be a time of brushing up on my Akkadian a bit and getting back into that, which is just so fun, but takes some focus and concentration. So that's what I'm looking forward to this summer.
It absolutely does require some focus and concentration.
Totally. Yeah.
And your lack of summer funding plight is felt by many. It is.
Oh, I know, eh? It's all the cool kids are doing it right now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So we'd love to open the questions up to any that have come in from the audience while you've been speaking. Do we have a date for the Book of Job? Is the Bible the only place the Book of Job is mentioned?
No. Well, do we have a date? The date is the great question. My personal theory is the redaction that we have, the final version that we have right now, is probably emerging in the Persian period. However, I think Job belongs to a long established genre of, we'll say, pious sufferers, a type of literature. And so we see within Job traces of ancient mythology that predate Hebraic thought, some Canaanite mythology, but its final redaction is probably Persian period, and we think that a lot of people think that based upon the number of Aramaisms in the text. And so, is it a hard fast rule? No, but that's the general gut feel from a lot of scholars. It has old elements, but it's it's Persian, I think. That's my gut feel. So
that's great.
Yeah.
We have another question from Mark. How were courts constituted, and were they public events like Roman senatorial debates?
Oh, cool question. I'm not entirely sure. I know. Okay, this is what I do know so far. I see two different wings of courts. There seems to be a temple type of court that operates, and I'm thinking more in the Neo-Babylonian period. So before that, I'm not certain, but within the Neo-Babylonian period, which is why I'm looking at the Book of Job, because that's the same period that it's emerging in. The Neo-Babylonian period, we have temple courts, and the temple courts, as far as I can see, were not able to enact judgments, but they would enact sort of like a symbolic or a religious or ritual sort of judgment that would be handed off to a type of administrative court, like a state court, or like city state. And there is where a judgment would be enacted. So there was like an interesting two-stage court system, which is quite fascinating. So there's a ritual aspect to justice and an administrative aspect of justice. And that also plays very, very interestingly into the Book of Job, if this is all correct. If it's not all correct, then my whole life has been for naught. But, we'll get there. So
it's good to talk in such big, bold terms as that.
Yeah, there's that. So
while other people are adding their questions to the chat, I'd love to throw some of mine out at you. And they come from a place of ignorance on the subject, so I'm hoping you can help enlighten me. Which is, you mentioned funkiness in both the legal frameworks, but also the compositional frameworks. And I'm hoping you can maybe expand a little bit on what funkiness means in this context.
Oh, okay. So the Book of Job opens with this very otherworldly divine counsel, common to other ancient Near Eastern myths, of the sons of the god, and God interviews them, and he draws attention to this dude named Job, and the accuser, or the Hasatan, says, hey, yeah, just take your blessing off for him for 1 second, and you'll see what a schmo he is. And then it happens, and so all hell breaks loose in his life. And then there's a sort of shift to some gorgeous poetry where Job lays out his lament of how horrible his life is, and then his friends sort of pitch in, and they go back and forth. There's a cyclical sort of sense of one character presents their view, and then another character knocks them down and smacks them. And then there's a major shift after some of those disputations, or those dialogues, the poetic dialogues. And we have a fourth character all of a sudden appear out of nowhere, previously unintroduced, who kind of goes off on a long rant, and then Job answers that sort of, and then the Almighty shows up, and there's this great whirlwind speech, and then there's this short epilogue. But the text for some people feels like it's very broken up into very distinct styles of poetry, very distinct styles of literature. And so the tension is, are these just rough redactions or the merging of multiple sources, or is this a one unified text? So that's compositional funkiness. The theological funkiness is, in some ways, the theology of the book seems to fly in the face of much of the conventional wisdom of the Hebrew scriptures in Mishlei and in Proverbs, and how the universe works, and good things happen to good people, and justice happens to those who show justice. And the Book of Job is basically like, yeah, the universe doesn't work that way. It's pretty rough, and who are you to ask? And it kind of leaves the reader, if we're going to go into reader response here, it leaves the reader with a question of like, what does it all mean? Like, how does this all work? And I think that's a great place to sit. So anyways, that's the theological funkiness. Maybe Orthodox theodicy or Orthodox theology is, on trial, or maybe it's just, anyways, there's so much fun stuff in there. But
I like that as a type of funkiness. We have a couple of other questions from the chat here. If the book's final form redaction was in Persian, Yehud, why no mention of some major contemporary concerns like second temple building or temple community?
Okay, the really fast answer, and I'm not the expert, but one of the things I would come up with on that is the book is intentionally trying to be universal, cosmopolitan. It's trying to be vague, that the place names are kind of vaguely Near Eastern, and we're not exactly sure. And I think that's actually how the literature is trying to present itself, not as a historical account, but as a literary account that could be used in many different locales. And I think that's why we don't see any real mention of cult or temple, or very little anything in that's in Judaic, actually. And that's actually quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, honest question about the book of Job. Why or how does Satan win the argument with God when Job ends up turning on God?
Oh, man. Okay, so does he win the argument? I don't know if the Hasatan is in direct opposition to God in that sense. I think we have to rethink that character altogether and see them within their legal framework of being a prosecutor, of saying, okay, here's what we think. Somebody's guilty, somebody's wrong, somebody is not just. And I'm just looking for the original text of that question. It went away. Oh, it's okay.
We can put it back
lovely. Up. Yeah, and you guys got to go too, because you have such a long day. Anyway, I don't think turning on God or challenging God in this narrative is actually a loss. I think challenging God is something that God wants, or at least gives space for, which is why this text is so strange. Because it seems to be like an orthodox theology that, no, you can't yell at God. You can't tell God where to go. And in this book, that's all turned on its head. So it's very human and very real in that way. So I don't think Job turned on God as much as Job entered into a great conversation with God.
Interesting. I like how well that ties into your reading of this in terms of legal framework of legal literature. Almost that's interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, it's crazy fun. I kind of have this funny hunch that there's that weird fourth character is basically just a reprise of the original accuser, which actually fits into the law system in Neo-Babylonian courts. So
interesting.
Yeah, they have a really weird thing where you can actually have the defendant change mid-trial, and that is really neat because we in Western jurisprudence we don't. And that's a really fun idea to explore and see how that fits or doesn't. So,
yeah, interesting, and what that might mean culturally about legal systems surrounding that. Yeah. Well, we're running near the end here, so I'd like to just throw out: is there anything you wish I had asked you? Anything you want to share with us before we part?
Yeah, I'm excited about your project and how you're trying to make scholarship human again. I had an old mentor who said, put the cookies where the kids can reach them. And there's a tendency in the humanities to try to keep up with the cool science kids, to make things so abstract and so far out. But I had somebody once tell me, if you can't explain it to a 15-year-old, at least on the surface level, you're probably doing it wrong. And I think about that a lot. Like, can we take these cool ideas and these like, we're all treasure hunters. We're all like nerdy kids. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah, let our nerd flag fly. So
100%.
Yeah. So anyway.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Yehuda. It's been an absolute delight to talk to you.
Hey, thanks for your time. And I appreciate the project.
Absolutely. And thank you, folks, for joining with us. We have finished now talking with the applicants for the Hebrew Bible. You can join us next Saturday at 10 as we dive more into the archaeology applicants. And hopefully we'll see you there and get a chance to answer some of your questions then. Thanks again, everyone.